Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Hope everyone's chillaxing today. That's a new word I learned from my 7-year-old. She's always keeping me on my toes, trying to figure out things. I was talking to her, and then she was sitting on the couch, just working on her little tablet device. And I asked her, "So what are you doing?" "Well, I'm just chillaxing. You gotta fight off the stress monsters." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Anyway, she's cute. So I have a group of very interesting cybersecurity users in my house. I have 5 kids, and they are very interested in testing my abilities to secure our home network. And they do this by, downloading games that have all kinds of interesting things in them, and accepting I will be a friend with everyone in the world, and so these are very real challenges that I think we all are facing in our homes. How many of you are tech support for your house? Anybody? So we got a few. Okay, you guys know the pain of trying to keep your users happy at home. Well, just a little bit about me. My name is Dean. I work for a local cybersecurity company called Braintrace. We've been in business for about 5.5 years. We're downtown Salt Lake, and we help a lot of small and mid-sized businesses and even some enterprise businesses with their cybersecurity needs. And so our goal is really to help protect companies from these types of events. And so we'll talk a little bit about the trends that we see across businesses in the Valley. We represent a large number of corporations in the Valley, and so we can share sort of anonymously the things that have impacted some of our clients and in ways we've helped them protect themselves from cyber attacks. All right? So thanks for inviting us. We're grateful for the opportunity to be here. I listed 5 successful attacks that we've actually seen against several different local businesses. So just being aware of it, like Jeff said, business email compromise is very real. We've seen clients lose $70,000. We've seen clients lose $100,000. We've seen clients get hit multiple times, losing very large sums of money over a short time period. So this is something that if nothing else you take away, just asking your IT guys or as the IT resources for your companies or your entities, are we taking reasonable steps to secure our email? That's something that we should be asking those responsible for IT, because the majority of these attacks we see are coming via email, by and large, and there are a few basic things you can do to secure email that I'll talk about in the presentation. Of course, ransomware is happening. One of the things that we noticed from these ransomware attacks is that for many of the new versions of Petya, which is listed as one of these new variants, the real problem with this ransomware was it wasn't just encrypting files and holding the ransom, it was also stealing passwords off of those computers. And if those computers are connected to your corporate network and there are passwords that work in other places, it becomes a real problem. And that's how we're seeing clients get infected over and over and over again, because they're in fact stealing those passwords to your administrative users or your domain. And so that just gives them access to a lot of computers, your servers, and things like that. So just be aware of that. Of course, we see attacks against email accounts so they can log in and commit other fraud. A lot of our clients are law firms, and they handle a lot of sensitive IP data. And so we'll see shareholders and attorneys being targeted so they can get into their emails and then try and steal information like copyrights or patented data or merger and acquisition data. So these are very real attacks we're seeing, and they're being successful against companies in the Valley. So just think that, no one's immune. There are reasonable and cost-effective ways to protect yourself, and just being aware of that. Of course, we see attacks going against phones and mobile devices. I think there was an article, I read this last week, about 800,000 Android devices that had been compromised by apps that were bad in the Android store. They were actually You know, they might be a really great app for storing your credit cards, but they also send some of that credit card data overseas too, right? And they might be making 25-cent purchases or $100 purchases, but those things kind of add up over time, all right? And then social engineering, just being aware of your Facebook pages, LinkedIn, anything that is out there about you can be used to target you. At BrainTrace, we have a team of hackers. They're good guys. They're white hat hackers that are basically, we will go in for a client and test the security for them. And then we'll find weaknesses, and then we'll write up a report. Here's what we found. We pretended we were bad guys. We got access to your accounting system, and we could have done some bad things. But instead, we're going to write up the 10 steps on how to fix this so it can't happen for real. So we do things called penetration testing with our hacker guys, and they're all great, very talented, and they're doing real world examples. And so I would talk to your IT resources, and if you haven't had something called a penetration test, then it's something to think about. Did I do that? Oh, updates. Updating your computer is a really good idea too. Just make sure it's actually from your computer. All right, so for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to quote 3 really reliable sources that talk about data breaches. Verizon is one of those sources. Every year, Verizon creates a data breach report of the attacks that were successful against companies around the globe. And the reason why it's important to read information like this, or make sure your IT folks or your security guys are researching this, is to know what's really occurring. And this only represents a sample of data breaches, but it's a fairly good sample of breaches. Also, the Ponemon Institute, in cooperation with IBM, they create a similar report, and they typically have a lot of smaller companies in their study, and so they provide data about breaches and what it costs per record, which is good to know as a business owner. Because if you are part of a risk management strategy, you need to know what your potential loss expectancy is. You know, many companies will do an annual loss expectancy. Well, if a breach is part of that analysis, you can know based on the cost of a data breach in the United States, you can estimate for you what a loss might look like, right? And of course, there's a lot of good science behind this, but understanding those just gives you more data so you're informed and you can manage risk for cyber just like any other risk that you need to manage, okay? And of course, lastly but not least, I also include data from the RAND Institute. So RAND is a think tank based in the northeast of the United States, and they do similar analysis. And they'll take the data from Verizon, and they'll take the data from Ponemon and other breach data that's been made available, and they analyze it to see if the numbers jive. So I like taking multiple approaches, so when we're really trying to balance out what a risk to an organization looks like, you probably have like a high number, you have a low number, probably somewhere in the middle. So it just gives you good data for making a valid risk-based discussion. So classic cons, as Jeff mentioned, classic cons still happen every day. There's postal fraud, there's check fraud. You know, I get those emails and I reply to them all the time. I never click on their links, but I will tell you I've gotten stacks of FedEx checks sent to me from overseas folks. You know, just like the people who were the middlemen in the KSL article, there are people there who legitimately are getting paid to basically traffic things, not knowing it's all illegal, right? They're earning a few extra $100 every week or something, moving these things around. So I get these all the time, and I've built sort of a collection. So just realize everybody's targeted. If you check your inboxes, you each probably have 50 of these, and they are legitimate. And I do, you know, I'm aware of both insider fraud, where internal employees are making tough decisions because they've been put in a financially difficult circumstance, and they see an opportunity internally, and then of course a lot of this is external. And this is typically where I tell the story about my son Joshua. Joshua, when he was about 7 years old, was a very, a very cute kid that he was very creative. And I remember having a conversation with Josh, and he says, Dad, what would happen if you died? And I said, well, Mom and I have some insurance, and it would pay for the house and food and, and all the things that we need. He's like, would there be money for toys? And I had to think really carefully. And I said, Josh, I'm really sorry to say this, but if I die, there will be no toys. I could see his mind working. And so, insider risk is real. Whether you want to admit it or not, we actually helped a client recover from some internal fraud where an employee who had an opportunity had actually embezzled over $1 million from the company, another law firm. And they didn't have good dual control and separation of duties, and so they realized a material loss of over $1 million plus the reputational damage that they took. So these things happen, but the cyber ones are the ones I'm more concerned about, because it's really the criminals are just evolving. They're using the same techniques, but now they're leveraging technology to make it easier to commit fraud. And so just being aware that this is, the game's changing a little bit with the tactics, but the whole purpose is they're just out there to rob you blind. And so just being aware of that, it's a real issue. All right, it's big business, over $3 billion in the US last year. It's a lot of money. And so when we look at what that means and what that can impact you, I have some good statistics here. For the clients that we've seen impacted, we're seeing losses between $200,000 to $300,000 being pretty common. All right, so just being aware of what that would do to your budget, what that would do to your department, and planning appropriate ways to respond and to hopefully prevent it. So as we look at the attack footprint of many of these, or the scenarios we're seeing, we're actually seeing the bad guys creating a dossier about the victim, about you or I, by gathering this data on social networks, using this information. Say you really love stamp collecting, and you've got it on your Facebook page. We'll see attacks where the bad guys will create a brand new website where they're selling very rare and expensive stamps at a huge discount. And then they might see that you went to a stamp convention, and they might say, oh, I think we may have run into each other. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself, but by the way, I saw this really awesome website that's selling stamps for a really great discount. I know the owner, and he's decided to close up his shop. You might want to take a look at it. And then, so very crafty ways to get people to go and look at things on websites, or to click on links, or to respond in a way that they would normally if you didn't have their trust. All right? So just be aware of that. And that's the same way our red team, our pen test team, has a lot of success getting into companies, is that we have about a 99% success rate when we're hired to break into a company on their behalf to find the weaknesses. We always get in, because there are very trusting people, particularly in Utah, that are happy to respond and to be very, very helpful. We even had a company we did some work for, and we called their help desk, and their help desk was happy to reset a password for us, even though we weren't even employees, right? We even got one of the help desk employees to give us their password, right? So just being aware that there are always weak links, because humans are involved, and by good training and good separation of duty, we can prevent a lot of these losses from being material, all right? So I like the Verizon report, as I mentioned before, because they include a very large number of reputable sources. The FBI is involved, law enforcement across the globe. They're collaborating on sharing data, and if they share the data, we can all learn from it. And then we can hopefully avoid these same mistakes that other companies are making. All right? So if I look really quick here, you can see that 75% of the breaches last year in the Verizon report were from outsiders, meaning probably hackers. It could be those poor Nigerian prince. Nobody reads his emails anymore, nobody trusts him anymore. But that's the kind of thing that is happening. But that also means that 25% of them are still happening internally. Internal people or accidents or intentional action. All right? So that we mentioned state affiliated. So a lot of our clients, because they're in the intellectual property business, they're being targeted by folks in China and Russia. I mean, that's a very real risk that is occurring because it's far cheaper for foreign governments to steal data that's about valuable U.S. companies are creating than it is to generate it themselves. A very real risk, all right? So, and of course, we mentioned how hacking is very, very common. A lot of the breaches include malware. Those are those invoices that are malicious. I actually had a client where they had a legitimate vendor that was providing services to them, sent them an invoice, and the invoice was infected. So the legitimate business owner had such poor security that they were distributing invoices to their clients that were infected. So even if it's from someone you trust, it still may be a risk, and so you want to make sure you're scanning these files and you're being really cautious with who's opening them and what you're doing. And this applies to HR folks. They're getting resumes all the time. And so just helping to raise that awareness and building a process for your HR folks, your accounting folks, that are going to be opening up documents regularly, a way to have them do those safely so they'll be protected. All right? Victims, we talked about, there's a large set of victims. It's across every industry. We don't see anyone really being immune from these sorts of types of attacks. I will show, this is from the public sector from last year. There were 21,239 potential breaches last year for public sector companies. So I think that represents a lot of folks in this room, right? That's a very, very large number. And of course, of all the attacks, there were 240 that were successful. And when I mean successful, they had significant losses, all right? And of course, if you're a small public sector and you have a large financial loss, it can be devastating to your program. You can be set back years, or sometimes we see organizations have to close shop because they lost all of their budget, and in many cases the leadership gets fired. It's a really sad thing. And so the goal is to be able to take basic precautions so that these events don't occur in your organization. And again, please keep in mind, I'm not trying to be scary, because I think a lot of this sounds really scary. But it is sort of the world we live in now. But as risk managers, you can apply the same risk management practices you apply in your business for cyber. You get the facts, you understand the threats, the weaknesses of the organization, and you can come up with budgetary numbers of ways to protect the organization. You can, of course, get excellent legal counsel as well as buy cybersecurity insurance. So we'll talk just a little bit about those kinds of things. Here are the other attacks that we saw. The real concern for me is if you fall under the category of a small or mid-sized organization, there aren't as many breaches in those organizations, but the ones that are breached, 83% of them go out of business within 1 year if they have a material loss. So that's sort of the numbers I get concerned about. We talked about classifications. You'll probably hear about things like denial of service. That just means they take the website and you can't get to it anymore for a period of time. If you're a bank and you're doing financial transactions online, that's a big deal. If you're Netflix and people can't get to your service, that's a big deal. But for most corporations, that's not really a problem. All right. but also web application attacks. So if you have a website and that website isn't well protected, that's another way that the bad guys can get in and do things. So this number is really a good number to use in the United States for your risk management efforts to calculate potential loss. Ponymon calculates that it's approximately $225 per record of what would be considered PII, personally identifiable information. So for every record you store on your systems that contains PII about citizens or customers, that's the cost for identity theft protection, helping them to basically recover their identity, the mailers, the notifications, and things like that. There's material costs associated with a data breach. And that does not include if there are class action lawsuits or if the state's attorney general in each of the states where you have customers, or citizens are impacted. So just realize that that's a fairly reputable number, and the average cost of a data breach in the United States, according to Ponymon, last year was $7.35 million. So that's very expensive. Those numbers are much higher than what we've been seeing in the Valley. Like I said, the numbers we're seeing are probably in the $200,000 to $300,000 range, but there are always exceptions. And then you have large data breaches that sort of skew the numbers a bit. All right? You can't really see that very well, but the most expensive records to protect are health records. And those are the records that the attackers, the hackers, go after frequently because there's enough good data in a health record to get a loan in the person's name or to establish a line of credit in their name. So the bad guys like health records because they typically give them enough information to reset passwords as well as to cash out. And just think most of the bad guys are really interested in cashing out. They just want to steal your money or steal your Bitcoins, if you have any. All right. The thing I like about Ponymon is they do sort of check and balance the costs. Ponymon says it's $7.35 million for a breach. The Rand Institute says it's actually probably closer to $200,000. My experience has been it has been closer to the $200,000 to $300,000 range, but there are the very large data breaches that, again, skew the data. Ponymon creates really good data that you can read about and how they back up their math. So I do recommend taking a look at that. And if you just want to understand what the cyber breach area looks like, this information is beautiful website, has a way to click in to the breaches that have occurred over the last 10 years or so by industry. So you can see public sector, financial, you can go through the process of looking at those breaches. Like, of course, there was a very large Anthem breach in 2015 that may have impacted a lot of our servants, public servants. So that's a great way to just look around and see all of the breaches that have occurred if you're interested. And then there's a list of the largest breaches. And again, these are the breaches I think that do skew the data a bit. So as risk managers, if you're trying to estimate what our losses might be, I would tend to stay closer to that $225 a record for the number of records you have. And of course, knowing what records you have in your organization can be very difficult because it means you have to classify your data and then you have to know where it's been copied. So for many of the clients that we've had that have had breaches, they actually didn't know where all of their client data had been copied to. Some of it might have been in the cloud, some of it might have been with a third-party vendor that they've shared the data with. So just understanding where your client information, your customer information, and your employee information resides is really helpful when trying to accurately estimate what a loss might cost the organization. All right, so you can see there are quite a few very large breaches. Sony has actually had 4 breaches over the last, I think, 6 years. So they are repeat victims because they haven't taken appropriate action. And so that's something to keep in mind. Like was mentioned earlier, the bad guys often keep coming back and back and back. As long as they can keep cashing out of your organization, they will, right? So taking good steps to manage this is really critical. Here's just some of the large payouts recently this year. Anthem paid out $115 million. The target breach in year one was 162. I read an update that each sequential year they had ended up paying over $100 million in reoccurring expenses. The total cost of the target breach is now exceeded $1 billion. Very, very expensive. And of course, if you look at their earnings per share, that's gone down dramatically over the same time. So it's definitely something that can impact the bottom line for an organization. So what I tell clients all the time is the only way to know what your risks are is to have a risk assessment done. If you have a risk assessment organization, leverage those resources. If you don't have someone who's trained in cybersecurity risk management, find someone who is, because they can be your advocate, or get good legal counsel and they can point you in the right direction. Because simply knowing what risks you have can arm you and help to defend you better, all right? So, like I said previously, when we look at the breaches that we see, a lot of them are from very basic things like patching, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But of all of the Verizon breaches, that represented a little less than 10% of the breaches that they were seeing last year were in the public sector. So definitely, it's not the smallest sector, it's not the largest, but it's definitely an area that's being targeted by hackers around the globe. All right, like Jeff mentioned, business email compromise is very real. Most of the losses we see come through business email compromise or just plain email compromise. How many of you would give me your password for a chocolate bar? There you go, we got a few takers. How many of you would legitimately think about it if I said I'd give you $1,000? Oh, good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because my goal is to just get into one of your accounts, because usually in one of your accounts, you're probably going to share passwords for other stuff. You might give it, you might send your spouse your bank account password, or you might send a Facebook password. All I need is one account to something that's not mine, and then I can leverage it. We had a client that was offered, that we saw a bounty on the web for $25,000 for someone to give up their work account password. Wow. Very real money. This is a big international company. They're probably a Fortune 50 size organization, but they had a bounty for accounts internally. There were some hackers that really wanted to get in. They'd stolen the money, so they didn't care. They had 25 grand to spend to get someone to give up an account internally. And now there were some stipulations. They wanted it to be a database administrator, somebody who had access to the data, which would make their ability to steal it very, very quick. But those are very real risks that we've seen in the industry not too long ago, right? Phishing, we talked about it, clicking on the link, clicking on an attachment, all of those things can lead down a path that's not really favorable for any of us, all right? There are lots of different types of phishing. The whole key point is that phishing is the most effective way to catch a victim. And so check your emails and click on links very, very carefully. The Verizon report shows that the browsers that we use and the documents we open are the primary way for attackers to get in. So making sure that all of your Office products that you use for Microsoft to open up Word or Excel or PowerPoint, making sure that stays current is really important. So make sure your IT guys are doing that for you. And then your plugins. If you've got Google as your browser, or you have any plugins you use, make sure those plugins stay current. Because Flash and Adobe, which are technologies that make your browser experience better, are often the way that the bad guys can get in and impact your machines, all right? So there's this whole new line of business that's coming up now. It's called crime as a service. Many of these ransomware attacks, you can go online and for $1,500, you can buy a ransomware pack of files, and you can become your own ransomware bad guy, right? And they come with tech support and a 24-hour call center with multiple languages. So if you want to know how to run your ransomware campaign in Russia, they have Russian language support, Chinese language support. We're seeing this whole, business organizational, capabilities for running a crime syndicate in your backyard. All right, so very interesting stuff. Of course, you can't really read this, but all that you really need to know is the number one way, according to Verizon, for fraud and crime is email, 93.8%. So Verizon believes that email is the number one way as well. All right, then browsers. So after email, choose the biggest way to catch somebody. Then it becomes your browsers and your plugins. And then we do see some activity, some other activity. My experience has been coming through mobile devices and smartphones. All right. So how many of you have ever seen this this patch window show up on your computer? Yeah, it probably happens for a lot of you. As long as it is one that is native to your Windows installation, not something that just pops up when you open up a web browser. That's something you should do. Just set your Windows computer to automatically update itself so that it just, every time a new patch comes out for Microsoft or for a Mac, just let it patch itself. And your browsers, your Google browser, your Firefox browser, or IE or Edge or whatever you use, just set them so that they automatically update themselves, because that will manage a lot of the risk for you. All right. Patching is really one of the biggest reasons why these ransomware events are successful, because we have a hard time keeping all of our stuff patched. So just keep your IT guys honest and ask them every quarter how they're doing on their patching, because that's an important way to keep the systems up to date and secure and safe. All right. If we do talk about the browser-based attacks, of that, like 8% of browser-based attacks or so, JavaScript is about 60% of that. So just by patching Java and JavaScript in your browsers goes a long way. And I know this is really technical stuff, but I'll just skip back to the 5 things that you should do as an organization if you're not doing them today. So this is where I would take this slide and talk to your IT guys and make sure they know what these are and that they're saying that they're doing these. That's really the takeaway. These are basic things you can do to secure email, and every business should be doing this. And if they're not, they're just making it really easy for the attackers to compromise your email. Obviously, your firewall is still a very good control. We will do assessments of companies and look at their firewall, and we find that their firewall is like Swiss cheese. It's got holes everywhere. And because over a period of 4, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe they've even upgraded their firewall, and they just copied the old rules onto the new rules, and now they're just perpetuating weaknesses in their corporate firewall. And so just ask them about if they're doing a good job of reviewing their firewall rules, at least annually. And then your endpoints, your laptops, your desktops, your servers, making sure that they're patching those and using good endpoint protection. Those are really important things to do. And then how many of you have ever heard of two-step authentication or multi-factor? Good. As an attacker in my red team, if the client has two-factor authentication, that takes about 60% of our attacks off the table. They will no longer work. So just by using two-factor or two-step authentication to protect your email, your social networking stuff, and what you do at work, you can reduce a tremendous amount of risk. It's one of the best investments a business can make to reduce the risk of these attacks working, is two-step or two-factor authentication. All right? So these are the things I recommend you guys have your IT folks do really soon. And then if you look strategically over the next 12 months, if you've done those first 5, make sure that they are doing these other items. And so you've got them listed there. Just make sure that when you talk with your IT staff, your security staff, they can explain to you what those mean and why they're important. And if they can't, please get some assistance. All right? So that's all I have. I appreciate it. Other questions that we can ask or answer for you? No? It should be in the folder. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My contact information's there. We just want to make sure that local businesses are staying safe, and we can, help with doing security awareness training or anything that you might need. So thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Elena Varadakis, big long Greek name, so. And I am a shareholder and lawyer at the law firm of Ray Quinney and Nebaker. And I'm also co-chair of the practice group of Cybersecurity and Privacy at our firm. I'm also a mom. My husband and I both work full-time, and we have 2 little boys. And we decided we didn't have, enough chaos in our house. So we have now started the process, and I'm 9 days away from getting a brand new puppy. Okay? Now, I've never done this before, and my kids have not, they've been exposed to puppies, but it's sort of a frightening undertaking. So I first, this started percolating a couple of years ago when I had twin boys, they were 7, and they started kind of making noises about it. We want a dog, we want a dog, we want a dog. So we kind of managed to hold them off for a little while, and I finally said to my husband, if you're not on board with this, we are not doing it, because the kids won't, I understand. So we got to the point where we were both on board with it. The kids obviously have been on board for some time. And I started reading and ordering books and listening to podcasts. And one thing that I found out was there was a lot of information I didn't know, and that everybody had a different take on it, right? I mean, things weren't necessarily specific to my breed, and even if they weren't going to be specific to my particular dog, right? So I was really overwhelmed by the whole thing. And someone finally said, listen, call my trainer. She'll teach you everything you need to know and do exactly what she says. And all of a sudden, it was like the clouds parted, because I thought, now I have someone I can consult with who knows my dog, who knows my family, and can sort of be a resource for me and can help me plan. So she's coming Saturday to look at everything from our equipment, whether we have the right crate, or everything. I don't know what she's going to talk about, because I don't know what we're doing. But anyway, that's the plan. And she's going to help set up a plan, look at the layout of our house, and kind of figure out where we're going from there, and then come and give us training. And it struck me that this is a lot like what I do at work. I'm sort of a cyber dog trainer at my office. And the reason for that is there's a lot of information. I mean, we've heard an hour and a half of information. There's a lot out there, some of which may apply to all of you, some of which may not. But it's really confusing to navigate. And so what I aim to do as a cybersecurity and privacy lawyer is boil that information down, help connect you with resources, and try and figure out what's applicable to you, what is scalable to your organization, right? You're not Manhattan, so you may not have the same resources and needs as a huge city might have. You may be something smaller. But the point is, we create scalable programs that encompass all of the things we've been talking about today. It's a way of organizing all this information and coming up with a plan like my trainer hopefully will be doing. So we start from the proposition that you don't know what you don't know. And with respect to government in particular, we have a poor understanding of what the other bad guys, not the other bad guys, the bad guys have, of what their resources are. We have a poor understanding of how effective our security measures are, and we have a poor understanding of the consequences of a successful attack. So we sort of start from that proposition, and I don't think that's unique to the public sector. I mean, this was a government report that put this together, but I think a lot of private entities find themselves in the same boat. So we'll start with the question of, if there is a data breach, are you prepared to answer the following questions? And I oftentimes think of myself, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for my law firm. And I think, if there was a huge breach and it got on the news, God forbid, because that would not be great PR, would I be able to, what would I say in response to the following questions? Do you have a written information security policy? Do you have one? We've created one at our office, and we do have a written information security policy. We'll go through the elements of that. What controls are in place? So you've got a media person saying, well, what were you doing about this? What kind of precautions have you set up? Did you train the people? I realized that somebody clicked on a bad link. Did they know they weren't supposed to do that? This is a pretty obvious scam. Did you do any training? When you onboard someone, do you teach them how to recognize potential problems? Do you provide any training? That's a big, important one. Because, like Dean was saying, not only is the insider threat real, but it may not necessarily be malicious, but people make mistakes. And the biggest vulnerability we have in our entities is human negligence. Do you have a written data breach response plan? So it's one thing to have an information security plan and say, this is what our information is, this is who's responsible for doing X, Y, and Z. It's a completely different thing to have a written data breach response plan. Because when the data breach happens, which is always on Friday afternoon, right? Jeff, it's always on Friday afternoon. That's when we see these happen most often, because people aren't paying close attention, they're out of the office. That is not the time to be figuring out what to do, right? Like my dog, my puppy, in the middle of the night is not the time to be figuring out, kind of where the potty place is, right? So you need to really understand who's the team? Who's the data breach response team? Do we have a PR person that's going to be getting word out to somebody? Who's our internally our IT person who's going to be in charge? Who is, do we have a forensics company on board to sort of try and figure out what exactly is happening? Do we have insurance? That's a big one. And then, I like to think it's the most important question, who's your lawyer? And I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think that's a really important first call. And I don't say that in a self-serving way. The reason it's important to have a cybersecurity lawyer on board, on your speed dial, is because if you engage us from the beginning, we can help protect the attorney-client privilege. So, for example, you may call me and say, we've had this data breach. We saw a couple weeks ago that this employee was doing some suspicious things. We didn't do anything about it, but now we really need to know what to do. You need to be able to have those conversations with me in a privileged environment, and I can create that attorney-client privilege and also help engage the other pieces of this. As a lawyer, I don't do the technical part of it, but I know how to engage people who do, right? I know people like Dean, I know people like Jeff at the FBI. We can help manage that entire process. So